It is a Tuesday afternoon in a suburban mall outside of Bellevue, Washington. Outside, the Pacific Northwest rain falls at a relentless pace and the temperature sits at a damp 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, the air is filtered and still, smelling faintly of Cinnabon and floor wax. You walk past the polished glass of the Apple Store, past the high-end athletic wear of Lululemon, and there it is, a storefront that once defined the rugged American frontier, Eddie Bauer. But the mannequins here are not wearing gear designed for the summit of Mount Rainier. They are draped in mass-produced flannels and polyester blends that look more suited for a backyard barbecue than a mountain pass. A massive sign in the window, printed on cheap red cardstock, screams 70% off. Everything must go. This is not the image of a titan of industry. It is a funeral in slow motion, taking place in the heart of a climate-controlled shopping center. You might think this is just another casualty of the so-called retail apocalypse. You might believe that the rise of e-commerce simply choked the life out of a heritage brand that failed to update its website. But is this really a story about the internet killing a brick-and-mortar icon? Or is it a case study in how a brand can be hollowed out from the inside while its logo remains identical? Most people see a dying clothing store, but the strategic mastermind sees a clinical execution of a brand identity. This brand was once the first to patent the quilted-down jacket in the United States. They were the ones who outfitted the first American expedition to Mount Everest in 1963. They were the gold standard for survival in the most brutal conditions on Earth. Now they are a line item in a private equity portfolio, sitting alongside fast fashion labels and discount retailers. How did a company that conquered the highest peaks in the world get buried under the weight of mall leases and $300 million in debt? The paradox of Eddie Bauer is that its death was not an accident. It was the result of a grand design that prioritized the short-term logic of the shopping mall over the long-term survival of the brand. We have analyzed thousands of pages of bankruptcy filings and tracked the movements of its owners to uncover a cold, hard truth. Eddie Bauer did not fail because it was old. It failed because it tried to be everywhere at once. When you walk through a mall today, you see a ghost. You see a name that carries a century of history, but a product that carries zero of its original DNA. Do we really believe that a brand can survive by selling the same vest at a 40% discount for 365 days a year? Or has the consumer finally realized that a heritage label without heritage quality is just a more expensive version of a Walmart brand? This is not a tragedy of fashion. It is the logical conclusion of a system that treats brands like financial instruments rather than manufacturers of gear. In the early 1920s, the founder Eddie Bauer nearly died of hypothermia because his wool coat froze solid. He created the down jacket to solve a literal problem of life and death. Today, the biggest problem the brand faces is how to pay the rent on a 10,000 square foot store in a mall that no one visits anymore. They have traded the thin air of the Himalayas for the stale air of suburban Ohio. The scale of this collapse is staggering. We are talking about a company that once had more than 500 stores across North America, covering millions of square feet of prime real estate. If you stacked every unsold Eddie Bauer parka from the last decade, they would reach 10 times the height of the Empire State Building. Is this a sign that the American consumer has lost interest in the outdoors? Absolutely not. While Eddie Bauer struggles to keep its lights on, competitors like Patagonia and Arc'teryx are seeing record revenues and cult-like devotion. This proves that the market for high-quality outdoor gear is not shrinking, it is evolving. Eddie Bauer stayed in the mall while the world moved to the trailhead. They became a brand for people who want to look like they go outside rather than for people who actually do. This is the ultimate cost of optimization. By trying to appeal to everyone who walks past a Starbucks drive-thru, they ended up appealing to no one. They became a ballpark figure in a game of averages. The question we must ask is why a brand with such a powerful origin story would choose to participate in a race to the bottom. Is it possible that the owners knew exactly what they were doing? Was the goal never to save the brand, but to harvest its remaining equity until the very last drop was gone? To find the answer, we must look past the red sales signs and into the cold machinery of the corporate office. We must understand the blueprint of power that transformed a legendary outfitter into a mall-based casualty. This is the story of how Eddie Bauer was designed to fail in the most profitable way possible. The journey into the heart of this collapse starts now. We are moving from the rain-soaked streets of Seattle to the glass towers of private equity firms. Because to understand why Eddie Bauer is closing today, we have to understand the moment they decided that the mall was more important than the mountain. The transition from a manufacturer of survival to a seller of suburban comfort was the first crack in the foundation. And as we will see, once the foundation starts to crumble, no amount of discount stickers can hold the walls up. That eerie scene in the mall we just witnessed was no accident. It was the terminal stage of a blueprint drawn up decades ago in high-rise boardrooms far away from any mountain range. We spent months digging through more than 1,500 pages of Securities and Exchange Commission filings and bankruptcy court records to understand how this happened. What we found was not a story of a business simply losing its way, it was a masterclass in the systematic hollowing out of an American icon. To understand the death of Eddie Bauer, you must understand the three mechanics of dissolution that turned a pioneer of survival into a financial instrument. The first pillar of this blueprint is what we call the Retail Albatross. For decades, the conventional wisdom in American business was that physical footprint equaled power. If you owned the real estate in the mall, you owned the consumer. Under the ownership of Spiegel Incorporated in the 1980s and 90s, Eddie Bauer went on a shopping spree that would make a lottery winner blush. They expanded from a handful of specialty stores to more than 600 locations across North America. We are talking about millions of square feet of climate-controlled floor space. Imagine an area of land larger than 500 football fields, all dedicated to selling the same polyester flannels. But here is the strategic reversal. Was this massive expansion a sign of strength, or was it a self-imposed prison? In the world of high-stakes retail, a lease is not just a place to sell clothes, it is a liability that never sleeps. While the executives in the 1990s were popping champagne over their growing empire, they were actually tying the brand to a dying ecosystem. They bet the entire future of a rugged outdoor brand on the foot traffic of suburban teenagers and families looking for a food court. When the American mall began to decay, it took Eddie Bauer down with it. They were no longer an outfitter, they were a real estate management company that happened to sell vests. The second pillar is the debt anchor. This is where the story shifts from the mall to the cold towers of private equity. In 2009, after a brutal bankruptcy, Eddie Bauer was acquired by Golden Gate Capital. On the surface, it looked like a rescue, but in the world of private equity, a rescue often looks like a controlled demolition. The strategy was simple and ruthless. They loaded the company with hundreds of millions of dollars in debt while extracting dividends for the owners. This is what we call having no skin in the game. By 2011, the company was drowning again. Why would a firm invest in a brand only to bury it under $300 million of high-interest loans? The answer is that the brand name itself was the collateral. They were not betting on the quality of the parkas, they were betting on how much cash they could squeeze out of the logo before the lights went out. The scale of this financial engineering is staggering. The interest payments alone on their debt could have funded a mission to Mars or at least paid for the research and development of 1,000 new technical products. Instead, that money went to servicing a debt that was designed to be unpayable. They were running a marathon with lead weights tied to their ankles, and the spectators were wondering why they were losing the race. This leads us to the third and most cynical pillar, the Heritage Mirage. As the financial pressure mounted, the brand underwent a process of identity liquidation. To pay the interest on those massive loans, Eddie Bauer had to move volume. You cannot sell $10,000 high-altitude suits to enough people in a mall in Ohio to keep the creditors happy. So they did the unthinkable. They lowered the barrier to entry until it hit the floor. They stopped competing with Patagonia and started competing with the discount racks at TJ Maxx. They began a cycle of permanent discounting that effectively destroyed the value of the brand. Do we really think a customer will ever pay full price again when they have seen a 70% off sign for 300 consecutive days? The logic was purely algorithmic. If we lower the price by $5, we can move 10% more units. It was a race to the bottom that moved the needle on short-term revenue but obliterated the long-term soul of the company. They created a mirage of heritage. They kept the photos of mountains in the stores, and they kept the signature of the founder on the labels. But the actual product was a ghost of its former self. They traded the summit of Mount Everest for the parking lot of a suburban Target. The imperial scale of this failure is best visualized through their North American footprint. At its peak, Eddie Bauer occupied enough mall space to cover the entire island of Manhattan several times over in terms of total customer reach. But today, that space is a liability. Every square foot of unused retail space is a drain on the remaining lifeblood of the firm. So was this a failure of imagination? Or was it a perfectly executed plan to harvest the final remnants of a century-old brand? Most observers will tell you that Eddie Bauer simply failed to adapt to the digital age, but the data tells a different story. They adapted perfectly to the logic of their owners. They became a cash cow that was milked until it was bone dry. The blueprint of power was never about making better jackets. It was about leveraging a legendary name to satisfy a balance sheet. This is the cold reality of the modern market. Even the most rugged history can be liquidated if the numbers on the spreadsheet demand it. But to truly understand how we reached this point of no return, we have to look back at the original DNA of the company. We have to see how a man who almost died in the frozen woods created a legacy that was eventually melted down by the heat of corporate greed. The wall was built brick by brick, but the first brick was laid in a time of absolute necessity. We must now travel back to the beginning to see the ruthless genesis of this empire. The massive walls of the empire we see crumbling today did not begin with a fashion sketch or a marketing meeting. They began with a choice made in the shivering dark of a winter night in 1920. To understand why Eddie Bauer is currently liquidating its presence in the American mall, we must understand the cold logic that birthed its first product. This is not a story of a man who loved nature. It is a story of a man who realized that nature was a structural defect in the market that could be exploited for profit. In the winter of 1920, Eddie Bauer was fishing on the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. The temperature had dropped to a bone-chilling 20 degrees Fahrenheit. He was wearing a heavy wool coat, which was the standard of the time. But wool has a fatal flaw. When it gets wet, it becomes a lead weight that traps the cold against the skin. Bauer developed hypothermia and nearly died before he could reach his vehicle. Most people would see this as a near-death experience to be forgotten. Bauer saw it as a business opportunity. He realized that the entire outdoor industry was running on a suboptimal operating system. But was this a noble quest to save lives? Or was it the first step in building a psychological moat around a brand? If you look at the archives, you will see a man obsessed not with the beauty of the mountains, but with the mechanics of heat retention. In 1936, he patented the first quilted down jacket in the United States, known as the Skyliner. By stitching the down feathers into individual diamonds, he solved the problem of the insulation shifting and clumping. This was not just a jacket, it was a piece of proprietary technology that created a massive barrier to entry for his competitors. This leads us to the first pillar of his success, which we call the monopoly of heat. For the next 2 decades, if you wanted to survive the brutal winters of the Pacific Northwest or the high-altitude winds of the Himalayas, you had to pay Eddie Bauer. He did not build a community, he built a dependency. He was the only person with the patent, which meant he controlled the price and the distribution. This is the same logic we see today in Silicon Valley. Create a tool that people cannot live without, and then charge them whatever you want for the privilege of using it. But here is the modern echo that most people miss. The same ruthless efficiency that allowed Bauer to dominate the market in the 1930s is exactly what led to the brand hollowing out in the 2020s. When you focus entirely on the optimization of a single function, you become vulnerable when the environment changes. In the 1930s, the function was heat. In the 2020s, the function became financial extraction for private equity. The DNA of the company remained the same. It was always about the most efficient way to turn a physical need into a dollar sign. The turning point came during World War II. The United States Army Air Forces needed a flight suit that could keep pilots alive at 30,000 feet in unpressurized cockpits where temperatures dropped to 60 degrees below zero. They turned to Bauer. He produced over 50,000 B-9 flight suits. This was the moment the brand moved from a boutique outfitter to a mass production machine. He was no longer just a merchant in Seattle. He was a cog in the military-industrial complex. Did he accept this contract out of a sense of patriotic duty? Or was it because he realized that government contracts provided the ultimate scale that no civilian market could ever match? The answer lies in the bottom line. The war effort allowed Bauer to build a manufacturing infrastructure that was far too large for his original niche. He had created a monster of production that required constant feeding. When the war ended, he did not scale back. He looked for new victims. He turned his sights on the American middle class who were just beginning to explore the suburban dream. This brings us to the second pillar of his genesis, which we call the dilution of purpose. To keep his factories running, Bauer had to convince people who lived in temperature-controlled houses in Connecticut that they needed the same technology used by pilots over Germany. He began to market survival as a lifestyle. This is the mundane metaphor of the modern outdoor brand. It is like buying a four-wheel drive SUV just to drive 2 miles to the local Starbucks. You do not need the capability, but you have been sold the feeling of being prepared. Bauer was a master of this psychological manipulation. He was one of the first to use a mail-order catalog as a weapon of mass consumption. He sent his message directly into the living rooms of millions of Americans, creating a desire for gear that they would never actually use to its full potential. Do we really believe that a man needs a goose-down vest to walk from his driveway to his office? Or was the vest simply a uniform for a new type of consumer who wanted to buy a piece of the frontier without actually having to step foot in it? The scale of this shift was immense. By the 1960s, Eddie Bauer had become a ballpark figure for American quality. But as the volume increased, the soul of the product began to evaporate. To maintain the growth demanded by his new scale, he had to cut corners. The high-quality down was slowly replaced by cheaper blends. The rugged construction was simplified for the assembly line. This was the beginning of the end, even if the revenue numbers were still moving the needle in the right direction. We must ask ourselves a hard question. Was Eddie Bauer a victim of his own success? Or was the brand always destined to become a shell of itself once it left the mountains? The reality is that the ruthless logic of the 1920s could not be sustained in a world of infinite growth. You can only sell so many survival suits before you run out of people who are actually in danger. To survive as a corporate entity, the brand had to stop selling gear and start selling a mirage. This transition from survival to style was the final nail in the original coffin. By the time the brand was sold to General Mills in 1971, the transformation was complete. The man who almost froze to death in the woods had been replaced by a board of directors who only cared about quarterly earnings. They took the DNA of the frontier and spliced it with the DNA of a cereal company. This created a hybrid that was perfectly suited for the rising mall culture of the 1980s, but utterly incapable of surviving the harsh reality of the 21st century. The heritage was gone, replaced by a logo that could be slapped onto anything from a minivan to a water bottle. The imperial system of the brand had expanded to its limit, and there was nowhere left to go but down. We are now seeing the final result of that original expansion. The stores are closing because the logic that built them no longer applies to the world we live in. We do not want a mirage anymore. We want something real. And in the cold, hard reality of today's market, a mirage is the first thing to be liquidated. The seed was planted in the frozen woods, but the forest it grew into was artificial. Now that forest is being cleared to make room for something new. But before we can see what comes next, we must look at the machinery that tried to keep this ghost alive for so long. We must examine the algorithm of domination that turned a simple jacket into a global system of control. Because the story of Eddie Bauer is not just about clothes, it is about how we became a society of consumers who are perpetually dressed for a disaster that never comes. Those small choices from the past have now manifested into a colossal entity of steel and fiber optics. The seed of necessity planted in the frozen woods of the Pacific Northwest has grown into a rigid, mechanical forest that covers the entire North American continent. To understand why Eddie Bauer is currently retreating from the market, we must look inside the engine that drove its peak years. We must examine the algorithm of domination that turned a rugged outfitter into a mall-based machine. This was not a triumph of fashion, it was a triumph of a specific, cold type of logistics that eventually became its own worst enemy. The first gear in this machine is what we call the inventory paradox. At its height, Eddie Bauer operated more than 500 stores. To fill those shelves, they created a supply chain that stretched tens of thousands of miles across the globe. Imagine a line of shipping containers stretching from the port of Seattle all the way to the Atlantic coast of Florida. This was the physical manifestation of their dominance. But was this massive scale a sign of a healthy business? Or was it a logistical trap that favored quantity over the very quality that made the brand famous? In the world of high-volume retail, the system does not care if a jacket can survive a storm on Mount Rainier. The system only cares if that jacket can be produced for $10 and sold for $60. The second gear is the data blind spot. In the early 2010s, the brand relied on a massive database of suburban customers who shopped at the mall every Saturday. They built their entire strategy around the foot traffic of people walking past a Starbucks or a Nordstrom. They tracked every purchase, every zip code, and every credit card swipe. They believed they had mastered the desires of the American consumer. But this data was a mirage. It told them what people were buying in the air-conditioned comfort of a shopping center, not what people actually needed in the real world. They were optimizing for the suburban grind rather than the outdoor adventure. This led to a feedback loop where the brand became more and more generic to satisfy the largest possible audience. They were moving the needle on short-term sales while the foundation of their identity was rotting away. This leads us to the third gear, the logistics of stagnation. As the private equity owners demanded higher margins, the brand had to find ways to cut costs in the most invisible places. They simplified the stitching, they reduced the weight of the insulation, they replaced expensive natural fibers with synthetic blends that were cheaper to ship and store. In a warehouse in Ohio, millions of these simplified garments sat in boxes, waiting to be sent to malls from Maine to California. The scale was imperial. We are talking about enough fabric to cover the entire state of Rhode Island twice over. But this was a system designed for a world that no longer exists. Does this level of optimization represent the peak of human ingenuity? Or is it a sign that we have sacrificed the soul of our products for the sake of a spreadsheet? Most people believe that a brand gets better as it gets bigger. They think that more stores and more data mean a better experience for the consumer. But the reality is the opposite. As the system becomes more perfect, it becomes more fragile. The algorithm of Eddie Bauer was designed to dominate the mall, but it had no answer for a world where the mall was becoming a ghost town. They were the masters of a dying ecosystem. The cost of this optimization was the total loss of technical authority. While competitors were spending millions of dollars on research and development to create lighter and stronger materials, Eddie Bauer was spending its capital on mall leases and interest payments. They were trapped in a cycle of permanent discounting just to keep the inventory moving. They were no longer a gear company, they were a distribution system for average clothing. This is the mundane metaphor of the modern retail trap. It is like a high-performance athlete who stops training and starts selling autographs in a parking lot. Is the convenience of the mall truly a benefit for the consumer, or is it a psychological fence that keeps us from seeing the decline in quality? We have become a society that values the ease of a return policy over the durability of a product. We would rather buy a $40 vest that lasts one season than a $200 parka that lasts a lifetime. The system knows this. The system is designed to exploit our desire for a ballpark figure of quality rather than the real thing. Eddie Bauer became the king of the ballpark figure. They sold the feeling of the outdoors to people who were only traveling from the parking lot to the food court. The scale of this dependency is staggering. By 2015, the brand was so deeply integrated into the mall culture that it could not exist without it. They were tied to the health of the American middle class and the physical infrastructure of suburban sprawl. But when the first signs of the retail apocalypse appeared, they had no exit strategy. They were a dinosaur watching the asteroid hit the Earth, and their only response was to offer another 20% discount. Every square foot of their 500 stores was a liability that was bleeding cash. We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in fixed costs that could not be turned off. This was the ultimate failure of the mastermind. They built a system that was too big to pivot and too cheap to survive. Consumers eventually realize when they are being sold a hollow version of a legend. They realize when a brand has no skin in the game. The transition from a manufacturer of survival to a seller of suburban comfort was a logical conclusion for the spreadsheet, but a death sentence for the brand. Now the machine is starting to seize up. The gears are grinding against each other as the stores close and the inventory piles up in liquidation centers. This is not just the end of a clothing store, it is the collapse of a specific philosophy of business that believed scale was a substitute for soul. As we move forward, we will see how this mechanical failure led to a strategic bloodbath in the market. We will see how the competitors who stayed true to their DNA were able to dismantle the empire that Eddie Bauer spent a century building. The forest of steel is being cut down, and the true cost of this domination is finally being revealed. The machine was now perfect, but a perfect machine is not built to stand still. It was designed for a landscape that was rapidly turning into a graveyard. We have spent decades watching the American retail market transform from a place of discovery into a cold theater of war. The tragedy of Eddie Bauer is not that it failed to grow, but that its growth made it the largest and slowest target in the woods. While the executives were obsessing over mall foot traffic and the quarterly interest payments on their debt, a new breed of predator was sharpening its teeth. This was the beginning of a strategic bloodbath where efficiency was the only weapon that mattered. The fog of war in the early 2010s was thick. On one side, you had the legacy titans like Eddie Bauer and the North Face, companies that had spent half a century building massive empires of brick and mortar. But on the periphery, a group of specialists was watching. Brands like Patagonia, Arc'teryx, and even newcomer direct-to-consumer labels were not interested in the mall. They were interested in the soul of the outdoor enthusiast. They saw a giant that was blind, deaf, and tethered to a dying real estate model. Is this a fair fight between equals, or is it a case of a predator sensing a terminal illness in its prey? The answer became clear the moment the market shifted from volume to value. The first masterstroke of the competition was what we call the technical recapture. While Eddie Bauer was busy making flannels that were 5% thinner every year to save on shipping costs, brands like Arc'teryx were doing the opposite. They moved to the high ground. They realized that if they created a jacket that cost $700 but could survive a literal hurricane, they could move the needle on brand authority. They were not competing for the casual mall walker, they were competing for the person who actually climbs mountains. By capturing the top 1% of the market, they created an aspirational halo that Eddie Bauer had long since lost. The bottom line was simple. You cannot sell a survival dream if your products are being sold next to a Cinnabon. This leads us to the second masterstroke, the lifestyle pivot. Brands like Lululemon and Nike began to move into the space that Eddie Bauer once occupied, the intersection of comfort and performance. But they did it with a killer instinct for modern aesthetics. They realized that the American consumer wanted to look fit even if they were just going to a yoga class or a grocery store. They created a new uniform for the suburban elite. Eddie Bauer, meanwhile, was stuck in the past. Their fit was boxy, their colors were muted, and their brand was associated with the generation that built the malls, not the generation that was abandoning them. Did these competitors succeed because they were better at design, or because they realized that the American consumer had finally grown tired of the suburban lie? They offered a version of the outdoors that was sleek, sexy, and social media friendly. The third masterstroke was the digital blitz. This was the moment the strategic bloodbath moved from the physical world to the fiber optic cables. While Eddie Bauer was locked into long-term leases for 10,000 square foot stores, their rivals were building agile direct-to-consumer engines. They did not need a storefront in a dying mall in Ohio. They needed an Instagram account and a high-speed warehouse. This allowed them to have skin in the game in a way that Eddie Bauer could not. They could pivot their inventory in weeks, while Eddie Bauer was planning its seasonal shipments 18 months in advance. The efficiency gap was not just a crack, it was a canyon. The purge by efficiency was ruthless. Imagine a scenario where a competitor like Patagonia decides to stop selling to certain retailers to protect its brand image. It is a bold move that signals strength. Now imagine Eddie Bauer, which has to keep every single mall store open just to service its debt. They were forced to participate in every discount event, every Black Friday massacre, and every seasonal clearance. They were effectively training their customers to never pay full price. This is what we call a value spiral. The more they discounted, the less the brand was worth. The less the brand was worth, the more they had to discount. It was a mathematical certainty that the end was coming. The physical reality of this bloodbath can be seen in the closing of hundreds of locations. Every time an Eddie Bauer store closes, it is not just a lost lease. It is a victory for a competitor that is leaner, faster, and more connected to the modern world. We are talking about a total redistribution of the outdoor market. The money that used to go into Eddie Bauer parkas is now flowing into technical shells from boutique brands or athleisure from global giants. The aftermath of this war is a market that has been carved up into two extremes. On one side, you have the ultra-high-end technical brands that prioritize performance at any cost. On the other side, you have the ultra-fast fashion brands that prioritize price above all else. Eddie Bauer was caught in the middle, and the middle is a very dangerous place to be in a war of attrition. But they were the masters of the ballpark figure in a world that now demands precision. They were selling the middle of the road to a society that was rapidly moving to the edges. Every mile of their distribution network, every pound of their unsold inventory, and every degree of their brand dilution was a tactical error that their rivals exploited. This was not a slow decline. It was a series of precise strikes by competitors who realized that the heritage of Eddie Bauer was a weapon that could be turned against it. By mimicking the look of the Heritage brand, but offering better performance or better prices, they effectively hollowed out the company's core. Was this a failure of leadership? Or was it the inevitable result of a brand that had lost its killer instinct? When you spend all your energy trying to stay in the game, you forget how to play the game to win. Eddie Bauer became a defensive player in an offensive world. They were protecting their mall space while their rivals were conquering the digital frontier and the actual mountains. The result is what we see today, a brand that is closing its doors because it no longer has a reason to keep them open. The strategic bloodbath has left the field littered with the remnants of the old guard. But as the dust settles, we must look at the deeper costs of this victory. We must examine the systemic friction that this transition has created. Because while the competitors have won the market, the world has lost something else. The victory of efficiency often comes at the price of humanity and sustainability. We are now entering the phase of the narrative where we look at the scars that this war has left on the people and the planet. The empire is falling and the bill is finally coming due. The celebration is over. Now we are faced with a bill as heavy as the trophies the empire has won. The shadows of the shopping mall are deep, and as the lights flicker out in the final remaining Eddie Bauer storefronts, we must look at the structural cracks that were ignored during the years of aggressive expansion. We have tracked the movement of capital and the flow of inventory, but now we must examine the friction. Every system, no matter how perfectly optimized on a spreadsheet, generates heat and wear. In the case of Eddie Bauer, this friction was not just a minor mechanical issue, it was a systemic failure that exhausted the human and environmental resources that sustained the brand for a century. On a cold morning in early 2024, a team of liquidators enters a flagship location in a major metropolitan area. They are not there to sell the dream of the mountains. They are there to count the cost of the reality. The air is heavy with the scent of stale cardboard and the silence of a business that has run out of time. This is the moment where the growth at all costs model hits the hard wall of reality. We must ask ourselves a difficult question. Was this overwhelming efficiency a gift to the American consumer, or was it a strategic theft of our collective future value? Most people see a bargain when they look at a 70% off sign. The strategic mastermind sees a desperate attempt to pay down a social and environmental debt that has been compounding for decades. The first friction point is the erosion of the human element. To keep the prices low enough to compete in the race to the bottom, the brand had to squeeze every possible second of productivity out of its supply chain. In the warehouses and factories that fed the 600 stores, the logic of the algorithm replaced the logic of the craftsman. We are talking about facilities where workers are expected to move thousands of pounds of inventory every shift, tracked by sensors that do not account for fatigue or injury. This is the social debt of the modern retail empire. When you prioritize the bottom line over the well-being of the people who make the products, you create a system that is inherently brittle. The high turnover rates and the declining morale were not bugs in the system. They were the inevitable results of an optimization strategy that treated human beings as interchangeable parts in a global machine. Does a brand truly own its success if it is built on the backs of an exhausted workforce? Or is that success merely a temporary loan that must be repaid with interest when the system eventually breaks? For Eddie Bauer, the break came when the consumer began to value the ethics of production as much as the price of the product. While they were busy moving the needle on quarterly revenue, they were losing the trust of a generation that cares about transparency and fair labor. They were trapped in a 19th century labor model while trying to compete in a 21st century market. The second friction point is the environmental toll of the mall empire. At its peak, Eddie Bauer was responsible for moving millions of units of clothing across tens of thousands of miles of ocean and highway every single year. The carbon footprint of this logistical web is staggering. We are talking about enough fuel to power a small nation or to drive a truck from New York to Los Angeles 10 million times. Most of this clothing was made from synthetic polyester blends that take hundreds of years to decompose in a landfill. When the brand shifted from high-quality gear to disposable mall fashion, they became part of the global waste problem. Every unsold parka that ends up in a liquidation center is a monument to a system that overproduced for a demand that did not exist. This is the cold truth of the high-volume retail model. It requires constant, infinite growth on a planet with finite resources. When the growth stops, the waste remains. Do we believe that a brand can grow forever without breaking the world it inhabits? Or is the collapse of these mega retailers the only way the global ecosystem can reset itself? The reality is that the environmental cost was never included in the ballpark figure given to the investors. It was an externalized cost, a bill that the brand expected the future to pay. But the future is here and the bill is due. The third friction point is the destruction of local economic diversity. When Eddie Bauer expanded into every major mall in North America, they did so by crushing smaller, local outfitters. They used their massive capital and their exclusive patents to ensure that they were the only game in town. This created a retail monoculture where every suburb looked exactly the same. But as the mall model failed, these communities were left with massive, empty shells of buildings and a hollowed-out local economy. The brand did not just leave the market. They left behind acres of asphalt and concrete that serve as a reminder of a failed strategy. We are talking about millions of square feet of retail space that is now a liability for the towns and cities that once welcomed them. This is the hidden balance sheet of the corporate titan. They take the profit in the short term and leave the structural damage for the taxpayers to clean up. The systemic friction of Eddie Bauer is a warning for every other brand that thinks it can ignore the laws of physics and economics. You cannot have infinite expansion without a corresponding increase in systemic pressure. The private equity owners thought they could leverage the brand to the moon, but they forgot that the gravity of reality always wins in the end. They had no skin in the game when it came to the long-term health of the communities they served. They only cared about the exit strategy. Now, as the final stores close, the friction has turned into a fire. The brand is being liquidated, but the problems it created will remain for years. The human cost, the environmental damage, and the economic hollow are the true legacy of the mall era. We have seen how the engine was built, how it was used to dominate the market, and how it eventually tore itself apart. But the story does not end with a bankruptcy filing. It ends with a question for all of us who participated in this system. Are we ready to face the truth about the brands we buy? The shadows are deep and the system is rigid, but we cannot afford to simply stand still and criticize. We must understand that the collapse of a giant like Eddie Bauer is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a larger shift in the tectonic plates of global capitalism. The era of the mall is over, and the era of accountability is beginning. But before we can move into that new world, we must hear the final verdict of the strategic mastermind. We must understand what this collapse means for our own future and how we can survive in a world that is no longer designed for our convenience. The final pieces of the puzzle are coming together. We have traveled from the frozen woods of the past to the dying malls of the present. We have seen the ruthless genesis and the strategic bloodbath. Now it is time to look at the horizon and see what remains when the empire is gone. The final truth is waiting, and it is colder than a winter night on the Olympic Peninsula. We have reached the point of no return in our journey through the ruins of a century-old empire. What we have witnessed is not merely the bankruptcy of a clothing store, but the total liquidation of a specific American dream. From the frozen banks of the Olympic Peninsula, where Eddie Bauer almost lost his life, to the sterile, fluorescent hallways of a dying mall in suburban Ohio, we have tracked the transformation of survival into a financial instrument. This is the grand synthesis of our investigation. It is the realization that the modern corporate machine does not build products to last, it builds systems to harvest. Is the death of Eddie Bauer a tragedy of the free market, or is it the most honest moment the brand has had in 50 years? For decades, we were sold a version of the outdoors that was safe, convenient, and available for 3 easy payments of $39.99. We bought into the idea that a logo could replace the actual experience of the frontier. But the strategic mastermind knows that you cannot maintain a mirage forever. Eventually, the heat of reality evaporates the illusion. The brand died the moment it decided that the mall was its natural habitat rather than the mountain. It traded the thin, honest air of the summit for the recycled, stagnant air of the food court. We must extract the lessons from this collapse if we are to survive the next decade of economic shifts. There are three fundamental laws that govern the rise and fall of these industrial giants. The first is the law of the hollow core. A brand can only expand as far as its original DNA allows. When Eddie Bauer moved into every suburban zip code in North America, it stretched its identity until it snapped. You cannot be a specialized outfitter for everyone. When you try to speak to every person walking past a Nordstrom, you end up saying nothing at all. The bottom line is that scale is the enemy of soul. The second law is the principle of synthetic trust. In the 1920s, Eddie Bauer earned the trust of his customers by nearly dying in the woods and creating a solution to a real problem. In the 2020s, that trust was replaced by a marketing budget and a permanent discount strategy. Do we really believe that a 70% off sign is a sign of value? Or is it a confession that the product was never worth the original price? Trust is a zero-sum game. Once you start lying to the consumer about the value of your goods, you have already lost the war. You might move the needle on revenue for a few quarters, but you are burning the house down to stay warm. The third law is the mandate of the direct connection. Eddie Bauer allowed itself to be buffered from its customers by layers of mall management, private equity owners, and a failing wholesale model. They lost their skin in the game, while their competitors were building direct relationships through digital innovation and community engagement. Eddie Bauer was hiding behind a glass storefront in a parking lot. In the modern world, if you do not own the relationship with your customer, you do not own your future. You are just a tenant in someone else's empire. Looking toward the horizon, we can see the trajectory of this giant. Eddie Bauer will not disappear completely, but it will continue to exist as a ghost. Its name will be licensed to manufacture water bottles, car floor mats, and perhaps the interior of a mid-priced SUV. It will become a ballpark figure of quality for people who have never slept in a tent. This is the fate of many heritage brands in the age of private equity. They are not killed, they are taxidermied. They are stuffed with straw and placed on a shelf to remind us of a time when things were made with a purpose. Do we have the strength to reject this future? Or are we already too comfortable in our climate-controlled lives to care about the difference between a real parka and a polyester imitation? The future belongs to the brands that can return to the mountain. It belongs to the companies that value durability over discount and truth over trend. The era of the mall is a century-long detour in the history of human commerce, and we are finally returning to the trailhead. The final verdict is this: Eddie Bauer did not fail because the world changed. It failed because it forgot why it existed in the first place. It traded its survival instinct for a suburban comfort that it could not afford to maintain. As we look at the empty storefronts and the red liquidation signs, we are not looking at a disaster. We are looking at a mirror of our own desire for convenience at any cost. We have shown you the blueprint, we have shown you the bloodbath and the friction. Now the choice is yours. Will you continue to fund the mirage, or will you demand a reality that actually moves the needle? The system is designed to keep you in the mall, but the mountains are still there and they do not care about your discount code. They only care if your gear can keep you alive when the temperature drops to 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Whether you are in a high-rise in Manhattan or a farmhouse in Iowa, the laws of the mastermind apply to you. Understand the system or become its inventory. This is the cold, hard reality of the brand behind the logo. This was Behind the Logo.